No empire in history has ever survived the death of its currency. Not the Roman Empire, not the British Empire. And now the United States is facing the exact same arithmetic of decay. Most Americans are waiting for a televised announcement that the country is bankrupt. They think a default happens when the government stops writing checks. That is a dangerous misconception. The truth is far more sinister. A sovereign default in the modern era does not look like a failure to pay. It looks like inflation. It happens when the state pays you back every single dime they owe you, but the money in your hand has lost the ability to purchase the life you earned. This is the silent default. It is not an accident. It is a mechanism. This is not speculation. It is a mathematical inevitability buried deep within the Federal Reserve's own data. We are living through the endgame of a monetary experiment that began on August 15, 1971, when the dollar was severed from gold. Since that day, the system has relied on faith, not value. But faith is running out. While the mainstream media distracts you with political theater, a strategic pivot is quietly being engineered in the shadows. There is a plan emerging to save the dollar from total collapse, but it requires a radical shift. It involves mobilizing the world's oldest asset, gold, and its newest rival, Bitcoin, to serve as a pressure valve for a $34 trillion debt bomb. This is the story of how the rules are changing. The financial elite are positioning themselves before the music stops. If you cannot see the pattern they are building, you are not just a bystander. You are the exit liquidity. To understand why the financial system feels rigged against you, we must return to the exact moment the crime was committed. The date was August 15, 1971. It was a Sunday evening. Millions of Americans were sitting in their living rooms watching the popular show Bonanza, only to be interrupted by a special broadcast from the Oval Office. President Richard Nixon appeared on screen to announce a new economic policy. He spoke calmly, assuring the public that these measures were necessary to stabilize the dollar. In that broadcast, he uttered a word that would become the greatest lie in financial history. He stated that the suspension of the convertibility of the dollar into gold was temporary. That was 55 years ago. Nixon did not end the gold standard because he wanted to modernize the economy. He ended it because the United States was technically insolvent. Foreign nations, particularly France and the United Kingdom, had lost faith in Washington's fiscal discipline. They began aggressively redeeming their paper dollars for physical gold bars from the U.S. Treasury's vaults. The gold was draining out of America at a catastrophic rate. Nixon was faced with a choice: either reduce government spending and induce a recession to protect the gold reserves, or lock the vault doors and refuse to pay. He chose to lock the doors. In that instant, the U.S. dollar ceased to be money and became a currency. Before 1971, a dollar was a claim check, a receipt for a specific weight of precious metal that could not be printed out of thin air. It had a physical reality that restrained politicians. If the government wanted to spend more than it taxed, it had to borrow gold. If there was no gold, there was no spending. The metal imposed a mathematical discipline on the state. When Nixon severed that link, he removed the handcuffs. The dollar became a fiat currency, a term derived from Latin meaning "let it be done." Its value was no longer derived from an asset, but solely from the decree of the government. This was the moment the debt unlocked. If you look at a chart of U.S. national debt from 1776 to the present day, you will see a flat line that suddenly turns vertical right after 1971. Without the restriction of gold, the government discovered a terrifying new power: the ability to finance infinite growth through infinite debt. They could fight endless wars, fund massive social programs, and bail out failing corporations without ever sending a tax bill to the citizens. But there is no such thing as free money. The bill is still paid, but it is not paid through taxes. It is paid through the devaluation of your labor. This mechanism relies on a phenomenon known to economists as the Cantillon effect. This is the invisible tax that explains the growing wealth gap in America. When the Federal Reserve creates new money, it does not distribute it evenly to every citizen. The new money enters the system through the top, flowing first to the government, major banks, and large financial institutions. These insiders get to use this fresh capital to buy assets like stocks, bonds, and real estate at current low prices. By the time this new money circulates down to the working class through wages, it has already diluted the currency pool, causing the prices of goods and assets to rise. The elite buy low with printed money, and you buy high with devalued wages. You are not just imagining that it is harder to buy a house today than it was for your parents. You are living in a system designed to transfer purchasing power from those who work for money to those who are closest to the printer. The 1971 shock did not just change the money, it changed the morality of the economy, transforming the U.S. financial structure into a pyramid where the base supports the weight of infinite leverage. The consequences of the 1971 pivot took decades to ferment. but we have now arrived at the exponential phase of the collapse. In financial markets, this is often referred to as a melt-up, but in terms of sovereign solvency it is a death spiral. To understand the gravity of the situation, you must look at the velocity of the decay. It took the United States 2 centuries to accumulate its first $1 trillion of debt. Today the Treasury adds $1 trillion of new debt to the balance sheet approximately every 100 days. This acceleration is not a result of political policy. It is the result of compound interest. The federal government has crossed a mathematical event horizon where it must borrow money simply to pay the interest on the money it has already borrowed. This is the classic definition of a Ponzi structure, sustainable only as long as new capital flows in faster than the obligations come due. But the interest payments on the national debt have now surpassed the entire defense budget. The engine of the American economy is no longer manufacturing or innovation, it is the servicing of its own liabilities. This creates a crisis of credibility that extends far beyond American borders. The phrase full faith and credit is the legal foundation of the US dollar. It implies that the government has the capacity to pay its debts through future taxation. However, the global market is realizing that the US tax base cannot mathematically cover these obligations without hyperinflating the currency. When faith evaporates, credit collapses. This is the driving force behind the global movement known as de-dollarization. It is not merely a political maneuver by rival nations. It is a rational risk management strategy. Central banks from China to the Middle East are quietly offloading US treasuries because they understand that holding American debt is now a guaranteed loss in real terms. The BRICS alliance is not forming simply to oppose the West. It is forming to build a lifeboat. They are creating trade networks that bypass the dollar system entirely, reducing their exposure to a currency that is being weaponized and diluted simultaneously. For the last 50 years, the global financial system has floated without an anchor. In the absence of a gold standard, the reserve currency functioned on the assumption that the United States would remain the undisputed hegemon of fiscal responsibility. That assumption has been shattered. The crisis we face today is not just about the size of the number on the debt clock. It is existential. A currency requires a bedrock of trust to function as a store of value. Without gold to restrict the supply, and without fiscal discipline to restrict the spending, there is nothing left to prove that the paper in your wallet has value. We are witnessing a confidence game running out of confidence. The world is asking a question that Washington cannot answer. If the dollar is backed by debt, and the debt can never be paid back, what is the dollar actually worth? The system is drifting, unmoored from reality, and the market is frantically searching for something solid to grab onto before the final correction occurs. To survive the volatility of a dying currency system, one must understand the difference between price and value. The financial media trains you to view gold as a speculative asset, something you buy hoping it will go up next week. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of its role. Gold is not an investment that generates yield. It is an insurance policy against the stupidity of politicians and central bankers. It is the anti-fiat. In the complex web of modern finance, every stock, bond, or currency note is a liability. A bond is a promise that the government will tax future citizens to pay you back. A stock is a claim on a company's future earnings. A dollar bill is a note of debt from the Federal Reserve. If the counterparty fails, the asset becomes worthless. Gold is the only financial asset on the planet that is not simultaneously someone else's liability. It has no counterparty risk. It does not require a CEO to make good decisions, a government to remain solvent, or a bank to stay open. It simply exists. This creates a glaring paradox in the global system. For decades, Western central bankers have publicly dismissed gold as a barbarous relic of the past, discouraging the public from holding it. Yet, if you look at their balance sheets, you see a different story. Central banks around the world, particularly in the East, are currently buying gold at the fastest pace since record-keeping began. They are accumulating tons of physical bullion while telling you to trust digital digits. They understand what is coming. They are trading their depreciating paper for the only asset that cannot be printed, hacked, or defaulted upon. They are preparing for a reset, where the only chips that count are the ones you physically hold. When you see the price of gold rising, you are looking at the optical illusion of inflation. Gold does not go up. The dollar goes down. Gold is the constant. The currency is the variable. Think of gold as a thermometer, and the price as the temperature. If the thermometer reads a higher number, it is not because the thermometer has changed. It is because the patient has a fever. The patient is the US dollar. Throughout history, gold has maintained a remarkably stable purchasing power. 2,000 years ago in the Roman Empire, 1 ounce of gold could purchase a high-quality toga, a belt, and a pair of sandals, essentially a fine suit of clothes. Today, that same ounce of gold converts to enough dollars to buy a high-quality tailored suit. The value has remained identical for 2 millennia. What has changed is the number of currency units required to measure it. In 1971, that suit cost $35. Today it costs over $2,000. Gold exposes the truth that the government is not making things more expensive. They are making your money worth less. This is the secret knowledge of the dynastic families, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, the Morgans. These are the families that have preserved wealth not just for years, but for generations. They do not obsess over the daily fluctuations of the S&P 500. Their primary objective is not to get rich, but to stay rich. Throughout the chaos of the 1971 Nixon Shock and the inflation of the late 70s, these elites did not panic sell their core holdings. They understood that in a fiat system, cash is trash. They maintained their purchasing power by holding assets that the system could not dilute. While the middle class was wiped out by holding savings accounts that paid less than inflation, the elite simply floated above the flood on a raft of hard assets. They know that gold is not a way to make a quick profit. It is the mechanism by which you transport purchasing power from one economic era to the next without it being confiscated by inflation. The system is designed to strip mine the wealth of those who hold paper and preserve the power of those who hold metal. If gold is the ancient enemy of the fiat system, Bitcoin is its modern predator. To understand the true nature of this digital asset, you must look past the price volatility and examine the timing of its birth. It was not created during a bull market or a time of economic peace. The first block of the Bitcoin blockchain, known as the Genesis block, was mined on January 3, 2009. This was the absolute depth of the great financial crisis. Embedded in the code of that first block was a text message. The time 03 Jan 2009 Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. This was not a random timestamp. It was a manifesto. Satoshi Nakamoto did not build a payment system like PayPal. He built a monetary system designed specifically to counter the central banking model. If the 1971 shock was the moment the government seized total control over the money supply, 2009 was the moment technology offered a way out. It is the first time in history that we have a decentralized, immutable ledger that operates outside the jurisdiction of any state, central bank, or corporation. It is the digital equivalent of a Swiss bank account in your pocket, protected not by borders, but by mathematics. However, the debate between gold and Bitcoin is often framed incorrectly as a civil war between two competing assets. This is a distraction. They are not enemies, they are allies with different functions. In financial terms, gold is the ultimate defensive asset. It is low volatility, universally recognized, and proven to preserve purchasing power. It is the shield. Bitcoin, by contrast, is an offensive asset. It functions as a call option on the failure of the fiat currency system. Because it is still in its monetization phase, it behaves with extreme volatility. It is the spear. When the system becomes unstable, gold provides stability, acting as a beta hedge that moves inversely to the dollar's strength. Bitcoin, however, captures the liquidity that is fleeing the system in search of growth. It offers alpha, an asymmetric return that anticipates the future adoption of a non-sovereign standard. One protects your wealth from disappearing. The other attempts to multiply your wealth as the old system collapses. The skepticism surrounding Bitcoin usually stems from its youth. This is a valid critique for the conservative investor. Gold has a 5,000-year track record. It has survived the fall of Rome, the collapse of the Weimar Republic, and 2 world wars. It is the only asset that has been stress-tested by every conceivable human crisis. Bitcoin is only 15 years old. It has never existed during a high-interest rate depression or a global sovereign debt default. We do not know for certain how the network will behave when the internet is fractured by war or when governments launch a coordinated attack on its infrastructure. This is why a rational protection strategy does not choose one over the other. The intellectual investor holds gold to ensure they survive today and holds Bitcoin to ensure they dominate tomorrow. They are 2 different technologies solving the same problem, the problem of trust. Gold solves it with physics, Bitcoin solves it with code. In a world where the dollar is backed by nothing but the promises of politicians, holding both the physical and the digital anchor is not redundancy. It is the only way to be fully diversified against the collapse of the middle ground. The real battle is not gold versus crypto. It is hard money versus easy money. And for the first time, hard money has a 2-front war strategy. The talk of a secret plan often drifts into the realm of internet fantasy. But if you strip away the political rhetoric and look at the raw game theory, a very clear picture emerges. The strategy forming around the return of Donald Trump and the shifting Republican platform is not a conspiracy. It is a desperate necessity. The United States government knows it cannot save the dollar in its current form. The debt load is too heavy, and the interest payments are too high. They cannot simply grow their way out of $34 trillion in liabilities. So the strategy shifts. If you cannot fix the currency, You must surround it. You do not replace the dollar. You build a fortress of hard assets around it to absorb the shock of its inevitable devaluation. This is the dual asset strategy. It is not about ideology. It is about collateral. This explains the sudden, radical pivot regarding cryptocurrency. For years, Washington treated Bitcoin as a threat, a tool for criminals that needed to be banned. Now the narrative has flipped to the concept of a strategic Bitcoin reserve. This is not because the government suddenly loves libertarian freedom. It is because they have realized that Bitcoin acts as a high-powered vacuum for global liquidity. By legitimizing Bitcoin and holding it on the national balance sheet, the United States effectively captures the world's speculative capital. If the US government becomes the largest holder of Bitcoin, it ensures that the future of digital finance is anchored in New York and Miami, not in Dubai, Singapore, or Shanghai. They are turning a potential competitor into a captured asset. It functions as a pressure valve. As the Federal Reserve prints trillions to service the debt, that excess cash needs somewhere to go. If it flows into milk and bread, you get hyperinflation and civil unrest. If it flows into a digital asset vault that the government controls, the inflation is contained within a financial sector that makes people feel wealthy rather than hungry. Simultaneously, there is the silent partner in this strategy: gold. While Bitcoin captures the digital flows, gold reestablishes the baseline of physical reality. The secret weapon of the United States is that it still claims to hold the largest gold reserves on the planet, over 8,000 tons locked in Fort Knox in the New York Fed. For decades, this gold has been valued on the books at a statutory rate of $42.22 per ounce, a number that is laughably disconnected from reality. The gold discipline in this secret plan does not mean returning to a hard gold standard where you can walk into a bank and swap paper for metal. That would restrict government spending too much. Instead, it involves a balance sheet revaluation. By recognizing gold at its true market price, or a price significantly higher, the Treasury can mathematically offset a massive portion of its liabilities. It creates a soft ceiling. It signals to the world that while the dollar is paper, the collateral behind the nation is solid. The endgame logic here is the creation of a bipolar system. In this new architecture, the US dollar remains the currency of transaction. It is used for daily commerce, for paying taxes, for buying groceries. It is the lubricant of the engine. But it is no longer the store of wealth. That role is surrendered to the dual assets of gold and Bitcoin. The wealthy and the state hold the assets. The public uses the currency. This allows the government to continue running deficits to keep the military and social programs funded, while the real money, the sovereign wealth, is protected in hard assets that rise as the dollar falls. It is a cynical, brilliant maneuver to save the American empire by sacrificing the purchasing power of the American currency. The plan is not to stop the inflation. The plan is to own the only things that survive it. In 1971, the suspension of the gold standard was sold to the American public as a temporary measure. They used that specific word to keep the population calm. 55 years later, that temporary fix is calcified into a $34 trillion trap that no politician dares to touch. The window for a painless solution closed decades ago. Now we are left only with consequences. The people who run the world, the true architects of this system, are not confused by the chaos. They do not wait for the crash to appear on the news to begin their preparations. They position themselves in the silence before the storm, quietly moving their capital into assets that do not require a counterparty's promise to have value. History is a cold judge. It does not care about your political affiliation, your patriotism, or your optimism. It only asks one binary question: do you hold wealth that can be printed, or do you hold wealth that must be mined? The system you trust is not being repaired. It is being re-anchored to a new reality. The chairs are being removed from the room, one by one. The music is slowing down. The only question that matters now is simply this: what will you be holding in your hands when the music finally stops?